Yo, what's cracking everyone? Ericship 111 here. So, as we know, the upcoming Forza Motorsport game will be released this year on October 5th, and I must admit, when the game had somewhat of a proper reveal earlier this year, I was just simply not on board with what Turn 10 presented, especially since it's been around 7 years in the making. All we heard was built from the ground up, very little gameplay along with car customization, literally showing the also dreaded Forza rear wing that majority of the community completely despises. Now with that said though, in the most recent Forza monthly livestream, the creative director from Turn 10, Chris Asaki, revealed a lot of information about what is perhaps one of the most anticipated aspect of the game, and that is of course multiplayer. I must say, although there were still some things that aren't perfect or a little disappointing to hear, in the grand scheme of how multiplayer online is packaged, I am very much looking forward to the new Forza Motorsport. Now recently I was fortunate enough to be invited to a private meeting with Chris Asaki himself, along with a few other developers, to discuss about multiplayer for further details, along with a Q&A that was not necessarily revealed in depth on stream, which I will talk about later in this video. So let's get into it. Within the new Forza Motorsport, there will be two main online PvP modes: private multiplayer and featured multiplayer. Now, featured multiplayer is most certainly the biggest overhaul Turn 10 has made. Chris Asaki mentioned in the private meeting that the multiplayer has been the most heavily invested part of the new Forza Motorsport game. This is so that they could build a solid foundation to really support clean and competitive racing, and the overall vision is to celebrate both race cars and production cars, with race cars being geared more towards actual racing, competition with real life racing vehicles, while production cars, although are still about the vehicles, is more about car building, racing with your friends, car ownership, and a little more of the fun but yet still competitive side of multiplayer. Which then brings me to the two main categories under featured multiplayer. First, we have spec events. Here you will find your fully homologated BOP style races with a combination of different parameters and rotating racing divisions that you can enter. The permanent racing divisions that will always be featured in spec events are your touring cars and GT racing, where there will be new events with different tracks and parameters every half an hour that you can enter, while the additional racing divisions can include your one make series like the BMW M3 event that you see on the screen, or other racing divisions that will rotate on a weekly basis to showcase different cars and other racing eras. All of the cars that you choose, whether it's your own car from your garage or a rented one in any of these spec series events, are completely tuned and balanced by Turn 10 to ensure that everyone is racing on an even playing field. To me, this is where I'll most likely be spending most of my time in multiplayer, to have two main and extremely renowned racing series events available at all times, plus additional different racing series events changing on a weekly basis, without having to consistently grind through the Builders Cup or any other races you do in the game just to have a competitive vehicle online, in my opinion, is a good thing, and it really amplifies what Chris Asaki said in the private meeting about this side of Forza Motorsport being about competitive racing. The other main category under featured multiplayer is open events. Now, the overall structure here is practically the same as the spec events, but here the events are solely focused on class-based racing, with new classes being rotated or being featured every week, and this is essentially the other side of multiplayer that Chris Asaki was saying, where car building, ownership, does come into play, leveling up your vehicle to unlock different upgrades through the Builders Cup or any other racing that you do in game to essentially build, customize and tune your vehicle and see how competitive it really is against other racers and their cars in that specific class. Honestly, I love how Turn 10 has included both the pure racers and tuners in their featured multiplayer without the overall online structure being completely disengaging like it was back in Forza Motorsport 7. Additionally, before any players even get a chance to race in the main spec or open series events, all players must enter the qualifier series where you must finish 3 races. This is to help all new players get accustomed to the rules and new race weekend structure, which I'll get into later on in this video, along with allowing the game to determine your driver rating, where you will be matched against similar level rating races once you enter a main featured multiplayer event. How driver ratings work in motorsport is that it's split into 2 categories. You have your safety rating and skill rating. Safety rating is basically how well you follow driving regulations by avoiding car collisions or corner cutting. Basically, the less grief you cause on the track, the higher your rating will be. And the ratings range from S being the highest all the way down to F being the lowest. Then there is skill rating, which ranges from the lowest at 1000 all the way to the highest at 5000. And Chris Sasaki said in the private meeting that skill ratings work off from something called True Scale, which is a little bit like the True Skill matchmaking back in Halo, but of course not exactly the same, and that Turn 10 collaborated with a lot of True Scale matchmaking gurus to help come up with an algorithm that is effective for being matched with similar skilled races. Now, you might see on the screen that it reads your skill rating is the primary value used for matchmaking, which isn't entirely the case. Chris Sasaki mentioned in the meeting that how you get matched up with players in featured multiplayer prioritizes proximity first, then safety rating, and then lastly, skill rating. Now you might be thinking, isn't that a little silly? Well, no, because let's say my skill rating is at 2000 and I'm racing against someone with a 5000 skill rating, both with a safety rating of S. I'm not expected to win that race, but if I come close to beating the 5000 skill rating driver, my skill rating value after the race may even go up. Now, of course, that also depends on how every other driver finishes in that race too, but it's extremely important to keep your safety rating as high as possible, because after enough races, eventually your safety rating will stabilize, whereas your skill rating will constantly fluctuate up and down after every featured multiplayer event. And since safety rating is a priority in matchmaking, if you are a dirty driver with a safety rating of E or F, that's who you'll be matchmade against. And I can only imagine how hard it will be to get your safety rating up from racing in those lobbies. Now, all of this just basically supports what everything Chris Sasaki said earlier about building a solid foundation for clean and competitive racing in motorsport, which I'm glad to see. This then brings me to the race weekend structure. So all the events in featured multiplayer, whether it's spec series, open series, or even the qualifier series, will follow the exact same 3 phases. Now, whenever there is a series event open for entry, you can see your local time at the top right hand side of your screen, when the series closes, when the race begins, and you can even see when future events are commencing as well, with up to 6 events scheduled forward. Now, once you join an event, you will first begin the first phase of the race weekend, which is called open practice. Here, you'll be able to adjust the car's fuel load, change different tire compounds to gauge on how these could affect the performance of your vehicle, and you'll also be sharing the track with the other 23 fellow drivers that you'll be competing against in the final race. And the reason why Turn 10 made this decision was that they found out through testing players were not only less likely to cause grief to one another or engage in toxic behavior, since they have spent a significant time sharing the same track with one another, but also allow you to observe other drivers to see how their pace really is around the track. Then we move on to the second phase, which is qualifying. Now, you can decide to not qualify if you want. It just means that you'll start at the back of the grid when the actual race begins. But with qualifying, you can decide to choose when to qualify at any time during open practice while still sharing the track with all the other racers. Now, don't worry, during open practice and qualifying, all of the other drivers that you are sharing on the track are completely ghosted. Now, you will have 3 laps to qualify, and whichever lap is your fastest, that will be the lap time that counts. Now, let's say if you do 2 dirty laps, which are faster than your clean lap, the game will count your slow slower clean lap over your faster dirty lap. But let's say you are about to go off track and get a dirty lap during open practice or even qualifying. Turn 10 has implemented a new feature called Skip Lap, where you can skip your current lap and move on to your following lap. Just remember that in qualifying, if you decide to skip a lap, your current lap time will be voided, so use it wisely. And we now move on to the final phase, which is of course the race. Now this is pretty straightforward, but it's important to note that generally speaking, spec racing events are much longer than open racing events, which is why adjusting fuel load and choosing the right tyre compound in open practice for these spec events are very important, as there could be fuel and tyre wear multipliers or even mandatory pit stops. Therefore, knowing your race, field, tyre and pit stop strategies are all vital. Now with open racing events, these races are generally much shorter, therefore pit stop strategies is not as crucial, but fuel load and choosing the right tyre compound still play a big part of the races. Now with all of these events, the FRR or Forza Race Regulations will be enforced, and it's been vastly improved since Forza Motorsport 7. And what this is, it's basically a machine learning tool which helps identify track cutting, purposeful collisions, and all around dirty driving, which could give out penalties during or after the race, or even the possibility of getting disqualified. Now, this was actually mentioned in the private meeting with Chris Sasaki about the new Forza Race Regulations, and I quote, "We use machine learning to drive our new FRR system. In the past, where we had maybe hundreds of specific collisions, we now have almost 5,000 separate incidents that we are tracking that allows us to determine who's at fault and who is not, and give out the appropriate penalties accordingly. We can now track multiple incidents and escalate a player's penalty based on how they're driving. The system can tell if you've accidentally spun someone out versus going off track, passing someone, T-boning someone, passing again, and so on. In that latter case, you'd get a super severe penalty because you've done multiple things at the same time. What we're trying to do is, if you're driving poorly enough to rack up enough penalty points, you'll be automatically kicked from the lobby." Now to me, this all sounds well and good, but I guess only time will tell as to how effective the Forza race regulations will work when millions of users play, but so far this does sound promising during the final stage of the entire race weekend structure. Other important things to note is that, let's say you have to pause in the middle of your multiplayer event, your car will automatically be ghosted and controlled by AI racing around the track at around 60 to 70% pace. There will no longer be any tire walls on tracks anymore. All track limits for each circuit have been completely redone, and also back markers or lapped vehicles will not be ghosted. This was intentionally kept as part of the challenge, but remember, with Forza race regulations, along with how important your safety rating is in featured multiplayer, I don't believe this will be a problem at all. Now let's move on to private multiplayer. Basically here you can set up lobbies with you and your mates, choose from a variety of game modes like circuit race, time race, multi-class, and even meetups, and the host can customize the race length, the car class, and track selection, as well as implementing the Forza race regulations too. There are also event rule presets to allow you and your mates to choose what kind of racing you want, whether it's going to be a relaxed race with limited penalties and no race strategy, or you could do a competitive event with strict penalties, required pit stops, and even simulated damage. You can also dynamically adjust the time of day along with different weathers on each track, which are all completely scalable. You can also adjust the dynamic track rubbering, additional ghost rules, minimum and maximum weight or power limit. There's quite a lot, and it seems like your typical private lobby settings we have been accustomed to from the previous motorsport games, but with additional rules and settings being available. And because these races are set in private multiplayer, your skill and safety rating will not be affected here. Also, I would like to note that there will be an option to seeing other user-created private multiplayer lobbies that you can look at or even possibly join. However, the race weekend structure from featured multiplayer will not be available to set up in private multiplayer, at least at launch. And also, fuel consumption and tire wear multipliers is also not available, however, could change in the future. Next up, we move on to Rivals mode, and this is essentially the same as how we know it back in Forza Motorsport 7. All of its tracks and different layouts will be separated into different classes, which will now be called time attacks, while the Rivals event mode will feature pre-built or tuned cars on a specific track that will also be available to rent for free. As you can see on the screen, there's a featured Rivals and also a VIP section. Both of the featured and VIP Rivals will have its events changed either on a daily, weekly or monthly basis. But all in all, it's really quite similar to Forza Motorsport 7 or even Forza Horizon 5. Every race you do in any part of multiplayer that I've mentioned in today's video will also go towards leveling up the individual car that you have specifically chosen. Now, with so many huge changes to the multiplayer aspect of the upcoming new Forza Motorsport, there are a couple of drawbacks. One being spectator mode. Unlike the previous Motorsport titles, you can no longer spectate other multiplayer lobbies. Now, the reason for this is because usually when you go and spectate a race, you actually take up a slot in that multiplayer lobby. And since Turn 10 really wants to focus on the racing element of multiplayer, taking up additional slots as a spectator when it could be reserved for an actual racer just didn't make any sense. So at this very moment, there will be no spectator mode, which is a little bit disappointing, seeing as it's been one of the unique features that the Motorsport series has had for years. And secondly, there will also be no split screen available, at least for launch. According to Chris Sasaki, this is due to the high graphical fidelity and complete game engine overhaul that just couldn't be made possible. But to me, those two features are not necessarily deal breakers. I just want the core of multiplayer racing, whether it's in featured multiplayer or private multiplayer, to work as good as it's been showcased. And lastly, some further questions that were answered by Chris Sasaki in our private meeting. The first question is, in qualifying, does the sector penalty still carry over for your next lap? And the answer is, you can still inherit a dirty lap if you went off track right before the finish line. Ultimately, it depends on how close your current sector is to the start finish line. Second question, is fuel consumption based on the car spec or is it uniform across all cars? And the answer is, it's based on the physics of the vehicle. The actual fuel limit is simulated in terms of the actual fuel cell or fuel size of the car, maximum amount of fuel that you carry in your car, and the fuel burn is based off of the physics around the car. Right now, there is no way to change your fuel consumption other than through just how you drive it. Next question is, will players have the ability to rejoin and get back onto their car after they disconnect? And the answer is, we're still working on this. If you crash out for whatever reason, your internet goes down or etc., we want you to be able to rejoin the same lobby that you were in. I've seen times where that has worked and I've seen times where it doesn't work. So it is something we are working on. Additionally, we don't have numbers we can share right now, but we've invested a lot of time onto our server stability and reliability. Next question is there a way to group up with your friends and then join the multiplayer session? And the answer is, there will be a group matchmaking for both featured multiplayer and private multiplayer. Now, let's say if there's a huge disparity in something like your safety ratings between your group of friends, this will be averaged out in matchmaking. So for example, a group of one S-rated player and a few D-rated players is more likely to be matched up with other D-rated or lower rated players. And lastly, is there a warning or flag system on track while driving? And the answer is, right now our multiplayer experience is solid without them, but as we evolve our multiplayer and competitive features, we may look into this in the future. So that is pretty much all the details about the new multiplayer in the upcoming Forza Motorsport. Share us your thoughts down in the comment section below, as I do read all of your comments, guys. And what else would you guys like to know about the new Forza Motorsport? Anyways, if you guys did enjoy today's video or found it helpful, please make sure to smash the thumbs up button, as it really does help me out. And of course, if you guys would like to stay up to date with everything Forza Motorsport related, be sure to subscribe as I'll be covering a lot more of it in the coming weeks, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Peace.